Welcome to Marian University. My name is Pierre Atlas. I'm a political science professor here at Marian University, and I direct the Richard Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies. And tonight is the second to last event of this academic year. And before I introduce our honored guests tonight, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Global Studies Center itself and our program. And then I'll introduce our speaker, and we'll get the evening on its way. So the Richard Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies consists of two parts. The first part is the academic program in global studies. Marian University offers a minor in global studies that is designed to fit with any major at the university in the professional studies or the liberal arts and sciences. We have students in nursing, in education, the business school, liberal arts, sciences, biology, pre-med, all these different types of majors who are minoring in global studies. The minor in global studies involves special interdisciplinary courses designed specifically for the global studies program. In addition to that, students are required to take an additional year of foreign language study, and also they must have a study abroad requirement. In fact, the global studies minor is the only academic program that requires students to study abroad at Marian. How many people in the room right now are in the global studies program? Very good, okay. We have Lugar Fellow scholarships for incoming freshmen who minor in global studies, again, in all of the different majors. If any of you are not at Marian and are interested in the program, I'd be happy to talk to you about it at the reception. If you have children or grandchildren who might be interested in the program, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. It's a very exciting program. It also involves a spring break trip to Washington, D.C., where I take the students there, and the speaker series as well. Now, the speaker series tonight, this is our 12th year of the speaker series. All of our events are free and open to the public. And we have one more after tonight that's left, and it's actually this coming Wednesday night, April 6th. And it is with Mark Miles, who is the chairman and CEO of Holman & Company. And Holman & Company owns the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the Indy Racing League, among other things. And his public talk will be on the Indianapolis 500-mile race, 100 years of global impact. So one of the neat things about global studies is pretty much covers all sorts of areas. It covers culture, it covers business, it covers economics, politics, history. We've had things with the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra. We do something every year with Catholic Relief Services, all sorts of humanitarian, faith-based issues as well. So please, if you're not on our mailing list, go ahead and let us add you to it. And please come to future events as well. And again, there'll be a reception afterwards. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about anything that you might be interested in for our future events. And then there will be obviously an academic lecture series next year as well. I'm in the process right now of putting that together. And all of our events run pretty much from September through April in the academic year. Okay, it is my honor now to introduce you to our speaker for tonight. Ambassador Feisal Amin Rasul Istrabadi is the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East at Indiana University in Bloomington. The Center for the Study of the Middle East is a Title VI federally funded national resource center with over 100 affiliated faculty. Ambassador Istrabadi is also professor of practice of international law and diplomacy at the Maurer School of Law at IU and at the School of Global International Studies at IU. He also serves as the associate director of Indiana University's Center for Constitutional Democracy. From 2004 until 2010, Ambassador Istrabadi served as the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary Deputy Permanent Representative of Iraq to the United Nations in New York. Prior to his diplomatic appointment, Ambassador Istrabadi served as the legal advisor to the Iraqi Minister of Foreign Affairs during the negotiations for the 2004 United Nations Security Council resolution that recognized Iraq's reassertion of its sovereignty after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. He was also the principal legal drafter of Iraq's interim constitution, the law of administration of the state of Iraq for the transitional period, and the principal author of its Bill of Fundamental Rights. At Indiana University, Ambassador Istrabadi focuses his research on the processes of building legal and political institutions in countries in transition from dictatorship to democracy. And as it just so happens, today in my Introduction to Comparative Politics class, we were talking about the transition to democracy. And so for those students from that class, I think you're really going to enjoy this presentation. He brings a multidisciplinary approach to studying the emergence of constitutionalism in such societies, including questions of timing and legitimacy, issues of transitional justice, and the political and cultural factors which influence the process of democratization. He lectures often at universities and think tanks on Iraqi-related issues, and he appears frequently on national and international media, including CNN International and Al Jazeera. Before contributing to the reconstruction of Iraq, Mr. Istrabadi was a practicing trial lawyer in the United States for 15 years, with approximately 70 civil trials in federal and state courts, focusing on civil rights, employment discrimination, and constitutional torts. He also served as a senior legal fellow for legal reform and development in the Arab world at the International Human Rights Law Institute at DePaul University's College of Law in Chicago. In 2015, he was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he's also one of 5 members from the state of Indiana on the Council of Foreign Relations. Ambassador Istrabadi is a native of Virginia. He was born in the state of Virginia, and then while his parents were here in the United States from Iraq, he returned to Iraq at the age of 1, basically grew up in Iraq, and then as a young person of about the age of 8, moved to Bloomington with his parents, and he grew up in Bloomington. He obtained his bachelor in chemistry from IU, and then his Juris Doctorate from Indiana School of Law in 1988. He then, as an active member of the Iraqi government, as a representative in New York, he went on and continued his education in getting a Master of Laws in International Human Rights Law from Northwestern University in 2005 and a Doctor of Judicial Science and International Criminal Law from Northwestern University in 2009. We always like to say that education is a continuing experience and being a lifelong learner. And I think both as a practitioner and a learner, Ambassador Istrabadi embodies all of that. It is my deep pleasure and tremendous honor to introduce to you Ambassador Feisal Istrabadi.
Thank you very much, Chair. That's very kind. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm honored to be here at Marian University and delighted at long last, after years of a Facebook friendship with Professor Atlas, to finally have met him. I think he knows my sister, who also teaches at Indiana University, and I think she's been up here in the past, but I've never had the pleasure of meeting him until this evening. So I am delighted at last, Pierre, to have had the opportunity to do so. I should also thank you for a very generous introduction. I intend to speak this evening for about, hopefully, 45 minutes or so, and then to engage you in a conversation to talk about what I will begin by talking about what I think is important, but we will end by speaking about what you think is important, and hopefully, perhaps, I'll have something to say about that. If I don't, I'll tell you. The topic, of course, is near and dear to my heart, the future of Iraq. Members of my family were intimately connected with establishing the state of Iraq, the modern state of Iraq, in the 1920s. I was quoted my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, who was perennially a senator in the monarchy, whose flag I wear in my lapel. My grandfather was on the Constituent Assembly that drafted Iraq's first constitution, the Basic Law of 1925. I then was, as I think Professor Atlas mentioned, the principal legal drafter of the interim constitution in 2003 and 2004, and the Washington Post quoted me as saying, "I hope that it will not be necessary for my grandchildren to participate in the drafting of yet another constitution for Iraq." Unfortunately, that trepidation may have been somewhat prescient. I don't know what the future of Iraq is going to be. I don't know what I'm going to say about the future of Iraq when I get to that part of my talk this evening. But maybe I'll figure something out along the way. I have a sort of a 3-part structure, and I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't like using PowerPoint. I have maps. But I have 3 things that I'd like to talk about. And first is to dispel 3 myths about Iraq. There are actually more myths than that about Iraq, but the program is only an hour and a half, so we don't have time for all of that. The second part of my talk, I will deal with the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, Others call it ISIS. The BBC, to its shame, calls it the Islamic State. And then the third part will deal with the prospects for Iraq. I'm putting that off as long as I can this evening. So if I remember how to use this, which is not a given, see? Oh, this one. There we are. Well, I always like to have maps in my talks. This is the part of the world that we are talking about. And, of course, this is Iraq here. And you see Saudi Arabia to the south, Kuwait southeast, Iran to the east, the country with which we have the longest border, Turkey to the north, Syria and Jordan to the west. The former Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq, Dr. Barham Saleh, once said at the Davos Forum in Switzerland that he wished that Iraq were a Pacific island nation because then it wouldn't have any neighbors. But unfortunately, that was not the fate the Almighty decreed to us. I have to tell you before I begin that it is extremely difficult for me personally to reconcile the pictures that you have seen on your television screens and that I have seen in person of the country that you see today with an elegant, vibrant, and cosmopolitan Baghdad of my childhood. It's unrecognizable to me, but we don't have time to talk about all that. There's a quote from King Lear. Now, my mother was a professor of Shakespearean drama, and she knows that I'm mangling the quote a bit, but indulge me, she would know that I'm mangling the quote a bit. King Lear, in the scene in which his madness starts to lift, but isn't quite lifted yet, when Gloucester is with him and he actually recognizes Gloucester. And he's sort of in that in-between state between madness and sanity. Says to Gloucester, "We cry that we are come to this great stage of fools." I'm glad I'm not standing on a stage. And unfortunately, we are in Iraq indeed come to a stage of fools. But let's see if we can work our way out of it. The first myth that I would like to address is the notion that 3 Ottoman Vilayets, that's the Turkish word for province, that 3 Ottoman Empire-era Vilayets were pasted together in an exercise of imperial hubris in the waning days of empire by the British during the mandatory period. Britain landed an expeditionary force in southern Iraq, in Basra, in 1914. It took them 3 years to occupy Iraq, and actually they never occupied all of Iraq. They met stiff resistance. The northern part they grabbed after the ceasefire, but that's another story. In actual fact, the 3 Ottoman Vilayets, and I don't know if you probably can't see this in the back, but that's that map here at the very end. And the reason it's at the very end is because the Ottomans divided Iraq into 3 provinces in 1884, which is to say more or less in the last 30 years of the Ottoman Empire. If you look through history, and forget this first map, this is way too general and covers 900 years. If you look at the period of Ottoman rule in Iraq from 1550 on, you can see that it has had a number of, and yes, I am using the modern borders, so I'm not concerning myself with what part of Iraq Kuwait was in this or that year. I'm using the modern borders of Iraq. Yeah, actually, this is from an article published by a scholar named Raidar Visser. In any case, you can see that there have been periods when Iraq has been administratively ruled in a number of different ways, including times when it was ruled as a single entity. Now, the point is that even when it was 3 Ottoman provinces, the governor of Baghdad was the primus inter pares, the first amongst equals of the other 2 governors, and the other governors reported to him, not directly to the Sultan in Constantinople or Istanbul. as he did, as the governor of Baghdad did. And they all were men, so that's not a sexist use of the pronoun. My point is, moreover, that the country is integrated. The economic transactions were within the three provinces primarily, as well as, of course, for centuries we were part of the Silk trade route. But that's another story. So it has been, in fact, a fairly integrated unit for hundreds of years. And the British didn't invent the idea of Iraq. There was a reason that they put Iraq together as a single country. Actually, there are reasons, but we don't need to get into all that either. The second myth that I wish to address this evening is that, well, one of the reasons we're allegedly an artificial state is that, well, if you look at the north, it's all Kurdish. And here, well, this was the Sunni area of Iraq, and here, this is the Shia area of Iraq. And so the British stitched all of this together, this sort of distinct homogeneous provinces, into a single country. Again, in fact, the situation is far different. Each of the three provinces was highly heterogeneous. So, for instance, I'm from originally the capital, Baghdad. Well, if you look at Baghdad, this is Baghdad Vilayet. As Radar Vista says, it's almost, up to the suburbs of the city of Basra is all in Vilayet Baghdad. The point is that the two Shi'i holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, for those of you who follow the news in Iraq, Najaf and Karbala are the first two holiest cities for Shi'i Muslims. They were both in Baghdad Vilayet, so that you had large numbers of Sunnah and Shia living in Baghdad. Indeed, my family, the Istrabadi family, are from Qazwain, which used to be considered across the river from Baghdad. Of course, now it's a part of the city of Baghdad. And we have been in Baghdad for 7 centuries. It is a well-known Shia family. My mother's family, on the other hand, is a Sunni family. And we're very highly integrated, particularly in the cities. But a mix, and the largest Kurdish city in Baghdad always was, until the 1990s, the largest Kurdish city in Iraq was always Baghdad. And when my parents were growing up in Baghdad in the 1940s, 1/3 of the population of Baghdad, granted there were only about 450,000 people living in Baghdad, depending on where you draw the boundary for Baghdad, there's 7.5 to 8 million now. But 1/3 of the population of Baghdad was Jewish. Basra Vilayet was also highly integrated. 1/3, roughly, of the population of Basra were Catholic. And there was a vibrant Jewish community there as well. There are also all sorts of religions that I suspect no one else but me, perhaps, has ever heard of, such as the Mandeans, who have thrived for millennia in southern Iraq. You may perhaps have heard of the Yazidis, who are in what was Mosul Vilayet, because there has recently been a genocide of the Yazidis. This is a group that is incorrectly often regarded as devil worshippers. In fact, they're not. But it's a syncretistic religion that combines many traditions of the Near East, including Islam and other religions, in any event. And as for Mosul Vilayet, the supposed Kurdish part of Iraq, well, of course, it has the city of Mosul, which is Iraq's second largest city, now under ISIL occupation, is an Arab city. Kirkuk, which is disputed, is a Turkoman, Arab, and Kurdish city. In Mosul Vilayet, you have Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Assyrians, Christians, Jews, obviously Muslims, Shia and Sunnah. All of the country was very highly well integrated. And I think that's a critical point. I have more to say about that, but I need to move on. keep pressing the wrong button. There we go. The third myth and last myth that I'd like to address is the notion of the Sykes-Picot borders. I don't know if you've heard this, but every now and then somebody will say the Sykes-Picot borders in the Middle East will never be the same. There were no Sykes-Picot borders. Sykes-Picot was an agreement between the British Foreign Secretary, the French Foreign Minister, and by the way, the Russian Imperial Foreign Minister, about spheres of influence divided up between the three presumed victorious powers after the First World War. This is the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, by the way. The Russians dealt themselves out of the agreement because of the Russian Revolution and the armistice they made, or the peace, or whatever it was, they made with Germany. But they would have gotten, by the way, the prize they had sought for centuries. They would have gotten control of the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. They would have had Istanbul. They dealt themselves out of that. Sykes-Picot did not set the borders in the Middle East. If you look, and I recognize there are two things you can't do. One is the map's pretty damn small, and the other is that there's no key to it. The blue bit, just under my arrow, that was supposed to be the zone of French influence. That was the zone of French control. Part A was the bit of French influence. Part B was the zone of British influence, and the red bit over here, as is appropriate for the British Empire, on which the sun was starting to begin to set by 1916, was the zone of British control. And the reason, by the way, that the Brits wanted this part of Iraq, and this was before anyone knew that there was oil in Iraq, in quantities that mattered, was because they saw Iraq as, or Basra particularly, as a part of the protection of British interests in what was then British India. And in fact, in the first period of the British mandate over Iraq, we were actually ruled by the India office, and the archives of that period are not in Baghdad or Basra, they're in New Delhi. But that's another story. So there were no borders, and in actual fact, a good chunk of Section A, if this were a border, half of Iraq would be in Syria today. Mosul and Kirkuk and all, is all was supposed to be in the French zone. Then the British figured out there's oil up there, because the first oil well in Iraq was drilled and began to produce in commercial or industrial, whatever it is, whatever the expression is, capacity in 1927. But before that time, they understood that there was oil and they grabbed it. So there were no Sykes-Picot borders. There was a division of spheres of influence. A pedantic point, perhaps, but nonetheless one that I have been making whenever I speak. In any event, this is Iraq today. Since June, I think the 9th of 2014, Iraq's second largest city, the city of Mosul, which is somewhere here, which is also on the Tigris, like Baghdad, has been under ISIL occupation. The city of Mosul fell in half a business day. It fell in 4 hours. A city of 1.8 million fell to a force that numbered in the hundreds, maybe 2,000 in 4 hours. There are reasons for this. The Iraqi army collapsed, and there's a reason for that. The prime minister at the time was a man named Nur al-Maliki. He had spent the last 5 years or so dismantling the Iraqi army. He had, as the English would say, cashiered, fired, competent officers and replaced them with individuals who were personally loyal to him. He had undertrained and under-equipped the army and had created security forces that reported directly to him outside the legal and constitutional chain of command, but whose loyalty he was certain of. In 2010, I attended a conference run by the RAND Corporation. Actually, it was financed by the CIA, but we weren't supposed to know that, in which a very senior American official who has only become more, well, not very senior, I don't mean it was a Secretary of State, but nonetheless, a senior American official who's become more senior now than he was then. I can't tell you who it is because we were under so-called Chatham House rules, which means nothing is for attribution, said when I challenged him on this is in 2010, said when I challenged him on the state of the Iraqi army that the American government knew that Maliki was coup-proofing the army. Well, he did. The army was wholly incapable of making a coup d'etat, but unfortunately it was also wholly incapable of defending the country. I have had a friend of mine who used to wear stars on his shoulders for a living in the American Armed Forces tell me that if you do to the American army what was done to the Iraqi army, and if officers flee as they fled in Mosul, no American army unit would have done any differently than the Iraqi army. The problem this has created is that while we're fighting a barbarous enemy, an enemy to all civilized mankind, we're also having to recreate the Iraqi army, to retrain it, and to re-equip it, and to reman it with competent officers. It is a Herculean task that you wouldn't actually wish on your worst enemy. But this is the reason that the Iraqi army has not been doing well, although it has made progress with American air cover, and this is why there are now 3,500 Americans back in Iraq wearing the uniform of this country, particularly special operations forces, and of course, aerial support. I'm not an expert on security issues by any means, but this is what I've been given to understand. The problem ISIL represents is not in terms of a military defeat. They will be defeated. I can't tell you that they will be defeated easily, nor can I tell you that they will be defeated without substantial casualties, unfortunately, including to civilians. They're entrenched now in Iraq. They're much more entrenched in Syria. Syria is a real problem. I have said in another context that you cannot solve the ISIL problem in Iraq without solving it in Syria. You can't solve the ISIL problem in Syria without solving it in Iraq. They are intimately connected. Nonetheless, I firmly believe that they will be defeated as an enemy. You can kill people, and if they won't quit Iraq and hopefully ultimately Syria, they need to be killed because they're that much of a threat to a civilized order. The problem is the idea that they represent. Fascism was defeated 70 years ago in Europe, and yet we see its rise again. And it's an ugly thing. You can't kill the idea. You can't kill the ideas. And even if they're seen to fail, as they did in fascist in Europe in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, if you start with Italy, that's not a guarantee that they won't recur. Part of the problem, in my opinion, and I will only touch on this, if anyone's interested, we can take it up in questions and answers, is that one of America's leading allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, and it has been since Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, is a purveyor of an ideology that is not wholly dissimilar to the ideology of ISIL. And if ISIL has been destroying cultural artifacts, including ancient sites and churches and mosques in Iraq and in Syria, it is to be recalled that when the communist states fell, in those parts of Europe that had Muslim populations, such as Bosnia-Herzegovina, such as in Albania, Saudi Arabia financed the destruction of mosques that had been, destruction not in terms of blowing them up, which is what ISIL did, and they have blown up mosques as well as churches and ancient sites, such as in Palmyra and the the ancient museum at Mosul. Not in that sense, but in the sense that they desecrated the mosques by removing the decorative tiles. Those of you who know what many mosques look like, by removing and destroying the decorative tiles and sort of whitewashing the walls in order to make them comply with their version of Islam, which is not accepted pretty much anywhere else. But they've been, with the petrodollars, able to finance these sorts of, so even though they did not destroy the mosques, they destroyed the interiors of the mosque. I would suggest to you that that is a similar activity. This is a real problem that must be addressed. I will leave that alone because it's not the topic this evening. But perhaps if there's interest, we can return to that later. This is an interesting map. I'll just touch this very quickly. This map on this side is an aspirational map. It's in Arabic, but anyway, that's Baghdad. This is Syria, of course. That's the border between Iraq and Syria, which, as you can see, the aspirational map that ISIL had published actually erases this border. Their capital is in Raqqa in Syria, of the so-called caliphate. This is the maximum they came to control. It's not, the two maps are not dissimilar. This is an actual map of areas they came to control. A lot of times, by the way, the media shows maps which shows ISIL controlling large swaths of territory. It's actually more complicated than that. What they have controlled is a string of pearls of cities, towns, and villages. But you can see in broad outline, they didn't miss by much. But this, I don't remember when this map was published, but I think it was in 2000, either end of 2014 or early 2015. This is where they are as of earlier this month. So they've suffered significant defeats. They're down to, they have lost 40% of the territories they held in Iraq, and they've lost about 20% of the territory they held in Syria. Syria is a whole nother matter. It's a complicated mess. But aside from a military defeat of ISIL, there will have to be a number of political accommodations made in Iraq in order to make sure, Al-Qaeda, it was first Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. Now we have ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq, and the Levant. The Levant, by the way, this is Bilad al-Sham in Arabic. Bilad al-Sham encompasses Syria, Lebanon, Israel and Palestine, and Jordan. This is a significant chunk of territory that's being claimed by these people. I know Iraq looks small on a map. It's in fact the size of California. It's the size of France, roughly. This is a significant chunk of territory they're claiming for this hideous ideology, if we give it that term. First, as I've suggested, militarily you have to deal holistically with Iraq and Syria. It does no good to bomb them in Iraq if they can slip across the border into Syria and vice versa. And to date, I see no strategy for dealing with Syria, none whatsoever. The second issue that will have to be dealt with is, and I don't like to deal in these terms, but unfortunately it has become a shorthand to talk about Kurds, Shia, and Sunnah. I mean, I've said to you, my father's family are Shia, my mother's family are Sunnah. I have Arab, Kurdish, Turkoman, and Persian blood, so I don't know if you divide Iraq where I would go if I went back. And I'm not unique. More or less every Iraqi I know has a similar story to tell. My children have my daughters have all of those, plus German-Irish, German-Irish Slovak, which makes them Americans, I suppose. So you need a holistic solution to the two. One thing that we have been told constantly is that the situation in Syria has influenced the problems in Iraq, and that's true, I have no doubt of that. But it is also true, the unmentioned bit of that is also true, which is that the problems of Iraq have influenced Syria. If you accept the narrative, and I said if you accept, and I don't, but if you accept the narrative that a Sunni minority ruled in Iraq and has been displaced by the Shia majority, you have the same situation in reverse. I don't mean to keep standing on that side of the room. You have the same situation in reverse in Syria, where an Alawi, or a branch of late, relatively, of Shi'ism, a minority ruling a predominantly Sunni country. And the problem is that if they look to Iraq, they see, if you buy the narrative, that when a minority loses power, it loses everything. That would make you fight tooth and nail too, to stay in power. It seems to me, therefore, in both countries, genuine power-sharing agreements have to be made, where it isn't a matter of do you hold this or that ministry or this or that post, but a genuine share of the levers of power have to be shared. In the case of Iraq, I'm no expert on Syria, in the case of Iraq, we need to engender genuine state institutions. This is what's been missing for the last 12 years since Ambassador Bremer did the unspeakable of dismantling the state of Iraq as his first act. Before he even arrived in Iraq, he signed the order on the airplane over to Iraq in 2003. That was the American administrator in Iraq. In a country as diverse as Iraq, it seems to me, only a secular civil state will work. This is a pipe dream. I don't expect in my lifetime to see the return of a secular civil state. We had one in until the 1950s, until my people were overthrown. But I don't expect to see a return to that in my lifetime. The best we can hope for is to work for it. The relationship of the Iraqi citizen ought to be based upon the fact of his or her citizenship rather than ethno-sectarian identity. At some point, I think the Iraqis will be ready to get back to that. I fear we're not there yet. I witnessed the evanescence of a shared Iraqi identity during the drafting of the interim constitution. That evanescence was palpable, if that's not a contradiction in terms. On a much, much smaller scale, I see similar threads arising in the inability of the two parties to carry on a civilized dialogue in this country, on a much smaller scale. But since I have seen the extreme example, it's a worrying sign nonetheless. There has been, and there is in fact now, a strong sense of Iraqi identity amongst Iraqis, except the Kurds. The problem is it's not a shared Iraqi identity. The last 13 years, and perhaps the 30 years before that under the tender mercies of the rule of Saddam Hussein, destroyed much of a common understanding of that identity, so that confessional identity informs many people about their national identity as well. The question is, can those two identities amongst the Arabs of Iraq be bridged? And I don't know the answer to that question. Let me move to the Kurds. This is a map that shows the distribution of the Kurds throughout the Middle East. You can see principally in Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. It is often said that, and it is true, that the Kurds may well be the largest ethnic group not to get a state out of the World War I settlement. there's truth to that. Be that as it may, and this is all I'll say about this map, if all of this becomes independent of the countries they're from, I do not expect a single Kurdistan. There's not a single Arab country. We have 22 Arab countries. And the political divisions between Kurdish groups, as I will talk about in more detail about Iraq presently, are as deep as they are between the Arabs. So you will have at least 4 or 5 or 6 or more Kurdish states, in my opinion, if they start going independent. And of course, the current administration in Turkey seems to be doing everything it can to ensure that the Kurds of Turkey will fight for independence. But that's a topic for another day. This is Iraq. This is the Kurdistan region of Iraq. One of my sparring partners on Iraq and particularly Kurdish issues is a man named Peter Galbraith, who is John Kenneth Galbraith's son, by the way, although he's only about this tall as compared to his father. But in any case, Peter Galbraith always makes the point, and we last tussled on Al Jazeera America, always makes the point that to get from the non-Kurdish part of Iraq into the Kurdistan region of Iraq, you go through what looks like an international boundary in terms of having to produce identification, being inspected, and so on. And that's true. What he doesn't say, but I do, is that to get from the part controlled by the Kurdish Democratic Party into the part controlled by the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, you have to go through the identical procedures, including showing your passport. Not that they stamp the passport, but they look at it. There is nothing uniting these two parties. Indeed, they have been in a constitutional crisis since August, when the term of the current president of the Kurdistan region of Iraq expired after a 2-year extension, but he refuses to vacate the office. The Speaker of Parliament, who is from the part of Iraqi Kurdistan controlled by the PUK, although he's from a different party called Goran, which means change, the Speaker of Parliament went home to the city of Slemaniya, which is somewhere here. Don't quote me on that, it's in there somewhere. For a holiday, the Kurdistani parliament had a break, whatever it's called. He tried to get back in time for a session of the parliament in Erbil, which is somewhere here, but was prevented by the KDP from crossing that border. And he still hasn't, the Speaker of the regional parliament has still not been allowed back in the capital of the region. The region is economically dependent on Iraq. They haven't paid salaries in the region since October. Universities in this part of Kurdistan have been closed because they can't pay the professors, and the professors refuse to teach. And universities didn't have the money, the public universities didn't have the money to keep the dormitories open. So they closed, as I was there in February, they had just closed the public schools in this part of Kurdistan. If you look at a map, there is oil in Kurdistan, but it is not enough for them to live on. It is enough for them to live on at $160 a barrel. It is not enough for them to live on at $40 or $35 a barrel. Usually when Brent crude is 40, and I'm no energy expert, but when Brent crude is around 40, and Basra Light is around 35. They're not economically viable at $40 a barrel. They're just not. It's not clear Iraq is economically viable because we have developed no other economic asset. And this is where the monarchy got things right. They were using the oil money, such as it was in the 50s, to develop an agricultural industry, to become the breadbasket of the Middle East. And by 1956, we were the fourth largest exporter of wheat in the world. Then the republics started coming one after another, after one bloody coup d'etat after another, and destroyed the agriculture of Iraq and turned the country into a rentier state based entirely upon oil. I'll leave that alone too. There was announced, sorry, that's an awkward way to start a sentence. A referendum was announced on Kurdish independence by the president of the KRG, and in the PUK area, they always say the president of the Kurdistan regional government whose mandate has expired, that there would be an election, a referendum, sorry, on Kurdish independence in Iraq. When he realized what he'd said, and that it would be in 2016, before the American presidential elections in November, when he realized what he said the next day, oh, by the way, it'll be non-binding. Now, the problem with this is that they don't have their own currency, and they have no foreign reserves. So they can't manipulate the currency, they can't devalue the Iraqi dinar, and they can't tap into hard currency reserves, which Iraq has. Not as much as it had, but it has. So they're economically absolutely dependent on the rest of the country now. And the idea is that they get 17% of the total oil produced in Iraq. Now, if I were from Basra, sitting on if I were from the southern three governorates of Iraq, Basra, Muthanna, and Dhiqar, sitting on 90% of Iraq's oil, what is my incentive to finance Kurdish independence with that 17%? If the goal is Kurdish independence, as they say in New York, Gesundheit, let them have independence. What's my incentive for financing all of that? And this is the problem. This is a part of the stalemate. We're not in the old days when Saddam Hussein could issue a decree and everyone obeyed the decree. Now, the Prime Minister of Iraq, weak though he is, has a constituency. Much of it is in the south. And he can't, there's a limit to what he can do to get out ahead of that constituency. I'm taking up all the time so I don't have to get to the actual future of Iraq. This is, in fact, creating a very difficult problem. The Kurds, in my opinion, and my grandfather on my mother's side, Mohammed Amin Zeki Beg, was a Kurd. Born in Slemania and used to represent the Slemania and the Monarchical Chamber of Deputies. Kurds of Iraq have to make a strategic decision. Are they in or are they out? And I don't mean for the next 10 years. I mean for the next 25, 30, 40, 50 years. We can't have this issue come up every time there's a kerfuffle. If they're out, they're out. Then they're on their own on the tender mercies of Turkey and Iran. If they're in, let's try to build a country together. But what do I know? I teach in southern Indiana, so who knows? And if you look at a map, even if they're able to develop, even if there's an economic justification for developing the oil, their key to the markets is through Basra. The markets are in India and China. Their key to the markets is through Basra, not through the Ceyhan pipeline that goes through Turkey to the Mediterranean. And by the way, Turkey's closed that down, that pipeline down. Which is to say, the Kurds would be putting their eggs all in the Iranian and the Turkish baskets. I believe they have, this is my personal opinion, the ideal situation now, which is they have a large degree of autonomy, you could say de facto independence, but they're within an they're secured by an internationally recognized border. On the other hand, the Arabs of Iraq would do well to remember that the Tigris and Euphrates, their source of water, flows through Iraqi Kurdistan. We already have Turkey building multiple dams, something like 30 dams on the Tigris, and Syria building dams on the Euphrates. We have Iran, I don't have it on the map, interfering with the flow of the waters that come into what's called the Arab River, Shatt al-Arab, which is the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates above Basra. Water is a real problem, and we still use ancient methods of irrigation. Do you want to throw up another international border between you and the Tigris and Euphrates? The Arabs of Iraq have similar divisions, and they're similar in the sense, I don't have a map for this. Oh, all right, that's a good enough map. And they're similar in the sense that there's really nothing binding the Shia of Iraq together and the multiple parties, or the Sunnah of Iraq together. My argument, and I confess to being a liberal, secular nationalist, Iraqi nationalist, for those who know Arabic, a watani, not a qawmi, which is Arab nationalism. I am an Iraqi nationalist, which are the kinds of things one has to define as one goes along when speaking in Arabic. There are two different concepts of nationalism in Arabic. In any event, Baghdad, in fact, the existence of Baghdad and the relevance of Baghdad to the Kurds has been what has allowed the Kurds to maintain an appearance of unity. That's true of the other groups in the country as well. I have a long to-do about this, but I'm running out of time, so I will just, perhaps if there are questions about it, I'll just elide most of what I'm saying. But the bottom line is to say that our options are these: to find a modus vivendi of cooperation between us, and I mean a modus vivendi. We've been killing each other for too long. Or we break up. If we break up, my opinion is that we break up a la Somalia. The Biden notion that you can break Iraq up into three parts is folly. We will break up like Somalia, with warlords controlling, except we'll be a Somalia with oil, able to finance warlords, some of whom will be the ISIL remnant. The two choices we have, and I can't tell you which choice we will make, is that between settling the problems, de-escalating the conflicts, or a total breakup of the country and a return to the pre-Hobbesian state of all against all, again, in an oil-rich environment. What I fear, not just for Iraq, but in Syria, and to a large extent it's already happened in Lebanon, I'm sorry to say, and in Yemen, is that the Westphalian state is going to come to mean very little in this part of the world, and that what we will instead have are militias that control parts of the area, which is a recipe like unto what I'm talking about in terms of the division of Syria, of becoming another Somalia, sorry. But I fear that that could be where the entire region is headed. Now, there's 2 points I'll make. It's almost 8 o'clock, and I promise to stop at it. Well, actually, it's after 8 o'clock. Well, that clock must be fast. I promise to stop at 8. There are 2 points I'll make. John Mearsheimer, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, is called a realist, which unfortunately makes the rest of us sound like fantasists or something. And he believes for instance, that the United States has absolutely no interests in the Middle East, that in the absence of a threat to affecting the territory of the United States has no interest. Which, by the way, doesn't seem to be altogether that far from the so-called Obama doctrine announced in the Atlantic article, if you have read that, the Jeffrey Goldberg interview, but that's for another story. The problem is that since the founding of the American Republic, for over 200 years, now almost 250 years, not quite, the United States has been deeply concerned with European affairs. And the European Union was actually proposed to de Gaulle by Dwight David Eisenhower when he was President of the United States. He called it a United States of Europe. Well, the crises that are going on in the Middle East now are threatening, as I mentioned earlier, the rise of fascist parties such as the Front National in France, but threatening the very, and UKIP in Great Britain and so on, threatening the very union of the European Union. This is aside from the threat to the United States, remote-ish right now, though it may be of a Brussels-type or Paris-type attack. Never mind that we have a Brussels and a Paris in Iraq every single day, by the way. But I digress. That, it seems to me, implicates the vital national security interests of the United States. I don't know what the hell I've just done. Insofar as its interests in Europe are concerned, and insofar as many of the countries of Europe are NATO allies, including, by the way, Turkey, which is having real problems now. So it seems to me that there is a real American interest. And since it took me so long to talk about John Mearsheimer and his view of the world, I'll stop there. And thank you very much for listening. I'll be happy to take questions.
Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned Paul Bremer.
Please, we're old friends. Just call me Excellency.
Your Excellency. You mentioned Paul Bremer and his order abolishing the Iraqi state. I wonder if you would mind going back to that period of 2003.
I would mind very much. Living through it once was enough. Thank you.
Okay. And just maybe tell us about what were the major mistakes that the United States made?
We don't have time for that. I was telling Pierre at dinner that, it's a long story, but I'm going to tell it, that one of the Marquess of Queensberry's younger sons was Lord Alfred Douglas, who was known to place a bet on a horse every day of his life. It is never recorded that he ever won a bet. And on the day he died, he placed 2 bets and lost them both. Oscar Wilde said of him that for a man who knew nothing about horses, he had a remarkable ability to pick the losing horse. That could have been the motto of Paul Bremer and the Coalition Provisional Authority. They came knowing nothing about Iraq and caring less. Anyone who spoke Arabic was sent home. The term Arabist became a term of derision. They treated the country as if it were a tabula rasa with no history. The arrogance was incredible to describe. I sat in as note-taker for my political mentor, Dr. Adnan Pachachi, the former foreign minister of Iraq, in one of his first meetings with Bremer. After these orders were signed, Pachachi said to him, look, we have a history of coups d'etat in Iraq. We have a way of dealing with coups d'etat, which is the new regime decapitates the previous regime, unfortunately all too often literally. But the next day, everybody goes back to work. And this is, I've been paraphrasing, but this is a quote. And the machinery of the state continues. Burma said, no, this is a new day in Iraq. Well, here's the new day. We're still dealing with the consequences of that decision. We're now in our 14th year. The war started on the 19th of March, 2003. The dissolution of the Iraqi army, the dissolution of state entities. My grandfather, my mother's father, was the first superintendent of the Iraqi Military Academy in 1920. The Iraqi army was established before the state, 1 year. The army was established in 1920. The modern state of Iraq was established in 1921. My grandfather was the first superintendent. He had been an Ottoman staff brigadier in the First World War. He was the first superintendent of the Iraqi Military Academy. When the defense minister, he later became prime minister, when the defense minister, Ja'far al-Askari, appointed a British advisor to the superintendent of the military academy, my grandfather resigned and retired in protest. This is in 1921. 80 years later was not a time, I'm trying to think of a word I can actually say in public when I'm being taped, was not a time to screw with those institutions that are deeply embedded in the Iraqi psyche. When you were never going to send more than 150,000 troops to control a country that size with hostile, our neighbors aren't, I said it's the size of California, our neighbors aren't Arizona and Oregon. We have, or whatever it is, Nevada or whatever the hell is out that way. I'm an East Coast person, I don't care about the West Coast. We have hostile neighbors. And it was just a decision of incredible hubris. But unfortunately, we're the ones who paid the price. Ambassador Bremer continued to collect almost $100,000 a speech for a very long time. Yes, Dr. I know he was Dr. Danner, sorry. Fada'i, sorry. Okay. I'm going back, 30 years, 20-something years, sorry.
Do you see a role for America at all, the U.S. in this region, in Iraq?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, help make the mess. It ought to help clean it up.
But how do you see them cleaning the mess?
Well, to begin with, no one in the region is capable of dealing with ISIL. There are capacities America has, no other country in the world has. I mean military capacity, including especially logistics. Nobody does logistics like the Americans. Again, I'm not a security expert. But the United States has capacities that nobody else has, so they have to be involved. But there has to also be a regional resolution. The notion that Saudi Arabia and its allies are bombing Yemen instead of confronting ISIL is odious. Yemen. The Houthis, who controlled Yemen, never represented an extraterritorial threat to anybody. And not only were they not clients of the Iranians, they are closer to the Iranians now that the Saudis are bombing them than they were before the Saudis started bombing them. But they've done nothing nothing meaningful in the fight against ISIL. But of course the Americans have a role. America has interests in the Middle East. Now the oil, there have been two bedrock policies of the United States since the end of the Second World War. One has been, in no particular order, one has been the protection of the State of Israel, and the other has been the protection of the oil lanes. Now the oil lanes aren't as critical as once they were, and not to the American economy. But nonetheless, there are economic interests in the area, and there are political interests in the area, and at the end of the day, there is an interest in ensuring that terrorism does not acquire a safe haven in the Middle East. And it has, ladies and gentlemen, acquired a haven, at least, hopefully not safe for long. So I think there is an American role. I'd just like to see a president who's up to playing that role. And I don't think we have, clearly, let me be very clear, this is not a partisan critique. Because the Obama administration's policies in Iraq have been a continuation of the Bush administration policies down to the level of the individuals, particularly the one individual I mentioned earlier, who's running Iraq policy on a day-to-day basis, at least. So it's a continuation policy that's bungling in the Middle East. Is that now we will have had 16 years of bungling in the Middle East, if not longer. But absolutely, there has to be an American role in Iraq. It remains the indispensable player, and the countries in the region are simply not capable of dealing with some of these problems.
Hi, I'm a senior here at Marian, and I know several of us will be graduating soon, and I wonder if you have any kind of advice. How can we help for those of us that have a lifetime to dedicate to foreign relations and social justice? What kind of steps should we take to kind of help with all of this?
You are reminding me that whatever lifetime I have to dedicate this to is certainly by your standards shortish, not longish. No, it's quite all right. Believe me, that's a thought that occurred to me long before this evening. The gray hairs focused one's mind. When I was sitting ambassador, I was invited to speak. Harvard has some sort of undergraduate program where they invite speakers to talk about, I don't know, careers or something. So they asked me, and the reason was I have a nephew who was, anyway. So I was invited. I was a keynote speaker to speak about career opportunities. So what in the hell am I going to say? I had been a trial lawyer, as Professor Atlas said. You know, tucked away in northwest Indiana, occasionally getting into Chicago, where I also had an office. Not the hub of the world, you might think. Well, Chicago, maybe. So I told him the only career advice I can give you is get the President of the United States to invade a country and be standing by and get a mentor to appoint you ambassador, because that was my route. That's not a particularly... But in seriousness, I mean, there are opportunities that are available to you at your age which were probably not available. If they were, I was unaware of them when I was your age. To engage, there are the issues that I think about these days, that I write about occasionally. You know, there are NGOs and government offices in Washington and in New York and other places that are engaged in these issues, which was not the case, shall we say, more than 10 years ago when I was your age. Strictly speaking, I wouldn't trade places with you, by the way. In the words of Honoré Le Chat in the musical Gigi, I'm glad I'm not young anymore. That's probably a lie, but... become engaged. I started, the reason I did what I did, what I ended up doing, is that I worked against the previous regime, began to work against the previous regime with my mentor, Dr. Patrici, the youngest nonagenarian I know. When there was no hope of removing the previous regime. And then it happened. And because of the work I had been doing, and I became known, I don't mean I was a household name, but I was known amongst the people who were organizing the kerfuffle in 2003. And that gave me opportunities to influence some of the things that were happening in Washington. And then opportunities presented. I'll tell you how I began to work on the interim constitution. When I got to Baghdad in December of 2003, I mean, my first trip back after 33 years in exile was in April, but I went back, and then June, and then I went back in December. I was practicing law full time. I had to put food on the table in the meantime. I was asked by Dr. But the drafting was already underway. And Dr. Patrici asked me to translate the Arabic text into English, because, as I said, the Arabists and the CPA had been sent home. So I did. And I went to him and I said, you know, Dr. Patrici, there's a there's a whole bunch of things in the Bill of Rights that should be there that aren't. And he said, oh, well, why don't you draft something, draft a memorandum for me in some proposed text. The more I did, the more he asked me to do. And the more I wanted to do. And so volunteer to do things. And I always tell my law students, always, 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 without fail, always volunteer to be the drafter. Because the controversial bit will be over 20% and you'll get 80% of what you want. You'll have to compromise on the 20, or you'll get some of that 22, so you'll approach 90% of what you want. I know nothing about you, and it's none of my business, but I'll give you this last bit of advice from someone at least twice your age. Marry well. I may have gotten some of the awards, elected to this and that. My wife's up for sainthood and she's Catholic, so it means something to her. Henry VIII and I have dispensations for our wedding. That's really important because I knew I could spend months in Baghdad because I knew everything was going to be fine at home. And that turns out to be really important. Or stay single if you want. That's another option.
Hold up here.
My old friend Tax.
Don't emphasize the old. You mentioned
Well, the friend, I really didn't know you that well, but...
You mentioned about the future of Iraq and had two scenarios.
You press the button. Are you pressing? The green
I am
light
pressing
should
the
be
button.
on.
The green light is on. You mentioned about the future of Iraq. You came up with two scenarios, and I'm just asking a third scenario, which you've briefly mentioned, and that is there any future of Iraq where the military steps back in? You had mentioned there is no military, they've disbanded it, but you know, it's like the Hydra head, you know, you chop off something and it comes back again and again. In addition to that, you have numerous militia that are small and localized, but these small guys can become big guys, can take over the role of the military. And that, in essence, is how a lot of states happened back 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago.
There is, and in fact, I don't think the army can make a coup yet. I don't think it's quite strong enough. But there are militias that can, at least in Baghdad. What you can't quite see, and keep a man named Hadi al-Amri, H-A-D-I-A-M-E-R-I. Keep that name in mind, because right now he's the only man who can make a successful coup in Baghdad. But he's not, he has no official position in the state. He simply controls one of the militias. That is very possible. That is a possible scenario. What I can't see is anybody who, in the old days, the army would move in and control the country. From the Fao, because I don't have Iraq up anymore, from the Fao Peninsula in the south to Tok in the north. That I can't quite see. And certainly not in the Kurdish area. I mean, the Kurds will declare independence and that'll be the end of that. So that is a scenario. But that is a scenario that leads to the second option, that leads back to one of the two options I talked about, which is the total disintegration of the country. Because there will then, if one person does that, and he might be able to, if Ahmadi does it, he could control Baghdad. But I don't think he can control Karbala and Najaf and Basra. He controls one of the Shia militias now. And so that, I think, breaks us down into warlordism. So that's a very plausible scenario, actually. But I think it leads to one of my two options. Yes, sir.
Well, in summary, we have three states there.
I'm sorry?
In summary, we have three states. We have Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, three failed states, one after the other. In these
three, what kind of states?
They're failed states.
Failed?
Yes.
Failed or failing, yes.
Yes. And they're failed along sectarian line. In Iraq, we know what it is. We have the Kurds.
We don't, actually.
Well,
I don't agree with that.
Well, they still pull themselves along that, provinces.
Let me get me to a question, and then I'll argue with you.
Well, the question is, all these three states are failed because of sectarian. In addition, they're all depends on foreign intervention, such as Iran or Saudi Arabia. This is the problem is not within, it's from the outside.
Well, this is, I take it, Dr. Barham Saleh's point, former Deputy Prime Minister and former Prime Minister of Kurdistan region, that he wishes we didn't have neighbors. You're right to a point, but the sectarian narrative takes you only so far, because first of all, I know very little about Syria and next to nothing about Lebanon, other than what anybody who reads the New York Times or in the old days, the Safir al-Arabi, which I'm sorry to say is just closed down this month, wonderful former newspaper in Lebanon, in Beirut. The hell was I saying? I know nothing about Lebanon. The sectarian narrative only carries you so far as a first approximation. Because at least in Iraq, and clearly in Syria, even within sects, you have tensions that have erupted into fighting. This is why I say, if these states truly fail, a la Somalia, you have wars of all against all. Sorry, I started speaking Arabic there. So in Syria, you have ISIL, you have Nusra, you have the Free Syrian Army. These are all nominally within the sectarian narrative, Sunnah. They've each fought each other. Ditto in Iraq. I'm not picking on Syria. I could tell you the same thing in Iraq. So it's much more complicated than that. And the last time we let a state fail where this sort of thing was going on was Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s. How did that work out? I don't remember. Moreover, Iran isn't just supporting Shia. Now, there seems to be some kerfuffle between them now, but Iran was supporting Hamas on the Gaza Strip. Well, Hamas is a Sunni religious organization. So it's much more complicated, and what's missing in the sectarian discourse is the notion that other than whatever else is going on, there's also something called politics and geopolitics going on. And that's a really important point too. The fact that we talk about the Alawis of Syria as Shia is a political, 50 years ago, the Shia would have, the standard 12 or Shia would have regarded them as heretical. It's a political process that makes them all of a sudden part of the Shia orthodoxy. So politics are happening. And I think we speak, I've done it myself, I do it myself in my publications, although I always put a footnote that notes that what I'm actually saying up there is a gross approximation of a very subtle problem. I don't know if anybody reads my footnotes. But we do it because I can't explain in a 40-page article, I can't spend 30 pages every time I want to speak saying what I'm saying now. But it's a gross approximation that is ultimately inaccurate to say these are sectarian discourses. They're also, at the very least, if not at base, geopolitical issues. We have time for one more short question if there is one. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the real problem...
So I can repeat the question, sorry.
You mentioned the real problem of ISIS is the idea.
Yes.
Who and how can that idea be corrected?
I should have stopped when I was ahead. What can I tell you?
Ace.
I will tell you...
A step of 1,000 miles starts with one. What's the first one?
Well, I've pointed out the problem. I figure that's my one step. Look, you know, I have American citizens who are white supremacists giving a Nazi salute probably somewhere in southern Indiana, not far from where I live, whose grandfathers fought and perhaps died against fascism in Europe. How do we deal with that? I don't know. I'd like to think that education is the key, and when I was young and stupid, I thought education was a civilizing influence. But it isn't. It can be, but it isn't necessarily. I don't know. I can say that some of the countries in my part of the world, part that I'm originally from, so where my family originates from, as I said, are responsible for spreading a hateful ideology. But again, these countries, this country is one of America's closest allies. Why? I can be put to death for practicing witchcraft, not by ISIL, although I suppose by them also, but by the government of Saudi Arabia. In 2016. How do I deal with that? And by the way, in case you think that if you just democratize Saudi Arabia, things will work out, you would get a much worse result in Saudi Arabia than you have now if you enfranchised people. That's my prediction. And not just in Saudi Arabia. I'm sorry, sir. You are asking for a sage to answer your question, and I have no greater authority than the former Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, former professor at the University of Chicago School of Law, whose name, naturally, I can't remember now, although I practiced in front of him in the Court of Appeals, who's a law and economics chap, who said that the law does not attract genius. You need genius to answer that question, and I'm just a lawyer. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this.